In 1971, a 71-year-old man stood inside the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, nominated for an Academy Award. He'd never taken an acting class. He'd never set foot on a Hollywood soundstage until he was past 60. He'd spent 27 years loading lumber onto ships at a dock in Vancouver. And he was wearing the name the government gave him when they took away his real one. His birth name was Geswanouth Slahoot. The world knew him as Chief Dan George. And the story of how he got from that dock to that stage and what it cost him is one that most people have never heard. 4 years before that Oscar night, this same man stood in front of 32,000 Canadians who'd come to celebrate their country's 100th birthday. They expected fireworks and anthems. They got something else entirely. He opened his mouth and told them that their celebration was his mourning, that their nation had been built on the bones of his, that every 100 years of their pride was 100 years of his people's erasure. The crowd didn't boo, they didn't walk out, they sat there silenced, and then they stood and gave him the longest ovation of the night. That speech would ignite a movement, and the man who gave it had been invisible for 6 decades. To understand how someone can be invisible for 60 years and then change an entire country's conscience in a single evening, you have to go back to 1899. That's the year Geswanouth Slahoot was born on the Burrard Reserve, a small piece of Coast Salish territory on the edge of Burrard Inlet in what's now North Vancouver, British Columbia. His mother was believed to be a descendant of Chief Waututh, the leader who'd met the ship of George Vancouver when the explorer sailed into those waters in 1792. His father was the hereditary chief of the Tsleil-Waututh nation. The family lived in a longhouse. They fished the inlet. They held ceremonies on the same land their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. Geswanouth grew up inside that world. He grew up with the Salish language, with stories passed between generations the way other families passed down furniture. He grew up knowing exactly who he was. That lasted 5 years. At 5 years old, the Canadian government sent him to St. Paul's Indian Residential School in North Vancouver. They gave him a new last name. First it was Slahoot, then George. The school didn't exist to teach him mathematics or reading. The school existed to make him stop being Indigenous. Residential schools across Canada were designed with a single purpose: to strip Indigenous children of their languages, their names, their ceremonies, their connection to family. The phrase used by government officials was chilling in its clarity: kill the Indian in the child. Over 150,000 children went through those schools between the 1880s and 1996. Many never came home at all. The ones who did came home different. Dan George was one of those children. He stayed at St. Paul's for 11 years. He was allowed to visit his family on the reserve, a few miles away, twice a month. He was forbidden from speaking his own language. The school was notorious for overworking students and inflicting punishment on children who slipped into their mother tongue. A federal report in 1908 had concluded that the institution was unfit to care for its students. The school stayed open anyway. It wouldn't close until 1975, 70 years after a government inspection said it should. Think about what that means. A 5-year-old boy who knew who he was, who knew his name and his language and the sound of his mother's voice in Salish, was placed into a building designed to strip all of that away. He endured homesickness, isolation, and institutional harshness for over a decade. And when he came out the other side, the country that had done this to him offered him nothing: no apology, no opportunity, no path forward, just a new name and the expectation that he'd become invisible. His son Leonard, decades later, put it simply: the effect of the residential school was devastating on his father. That's why he worked so hard to show that change had to happen, that Indigenous people are strong and must remember who they are. The mission of the school was to make him forget. He spent the rest of his life refusing to. Years later, George himself would describe it with characteristic plainness. He said his culture was like a wounded stag that had crawled away into the forest to bleed and die alone. The only thing that could truly help, he said, was genuine love. He left St. Paul's at 16, not because he graduated, because the system had a ceiling for how much education an Indigenous child was permitted to receive. And so a teenager walked out of a school that had spent a decade trying to erase him and stepped into a country that had no place for him. He became a logger. He married Amy Jack, a young Squamish woman, in an arranged marriage when he was about 19. She was 16. It was the beginning of a partnership that would last over half a century and shape everything that followed. They had 8 children. 6 survived into adulthood: Amy Marie, Anne, Irene, Rose, Leonard and Robert. He drove a school bus. He worked construction. He operated cranes. He loaded ships as a longshoreman on the Vancouver waterfront for 27 years, hauling timber during long shifts, gambling and drinking in the spaces between, living a life that looked from the outside like it was heading exactly nowhere. But here's the thing that nobody outside his community could see. Dan George was at his core a performer. He understood the weight of a pause. He understood how to hold silence until it became a statement. He could tell a story that made a room go still. There was no stage for an Indigenous man in the 1930s and 1940s. There was barely a country that acknowledged he existed. Under the Indian Act, which had been law since 1876, the government controlled where Indigenous people could live, whether they could vote, whether they could hire a lawyer, whether they could leave their reserve without permission. Until 1960, Indigenous Canadians couldn't even vote in federal elections without giving up their legal status as Indians. Dan George lived under that system for most of his adult life. He had the talent of an actor and the legal standing of a ward of the state. Then in 1947, a load of timber smashed his leg and hip on the docks. The injury ended his longshoreman career. He was in his late 40s with 6 children and a busted body and no clear path forward. Most people in that position find another labour job and grind through the rest of their years. Dan George did something different. He got in a truck with his kids and started driving. They called themselves Dan George and his Indian Entertainers. They played country western music at dances and fairs and rodeos across British Columbia 3 or 4 nights a week. They slept in the covered truck. In the summers, they picked hops for extra money. The kids took special requests from the audience for tips. Dan played bass fiddle and told stories between songs. But there was another layer to what they did. They also performed traditional Tsleil-Waututh songs and dances, which took real courage, because the Indian Act still made it illegal for Indigenous people to practice their own cultural ceremonies. So they dressed in plain-style headdresses and buckskins, Hollywood costumes that weren't their own. Their audiences didn't know the difference. To most Canadians, all Indigenous people looked like the ones in the Western movies. The disguise let them hide their real culture inside a stereotype. It was an act of preservation dressed up as entertainment. Dan George later said those years on the road were the happiest of his life. When the government finally lifted the ban on traditional cultural practices in 1951, Dan George didn't waste a day. He formed the Children of Takaya dance group, a troupe that performed authentic Coast Salish songs and dances in proper regalia. That group still exists today. It's the oldest and longest running traditional Indigenous performing arts group in British Columbia. He'd spent years smuggling his culture through a country that had outlawed it. Now he could carry it in the open. That same year, 1951, he became the elected chief of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. His brother Harry had left the area and George stepped into the role. The band was small, roughly 200 members. He served for 12 years until 1963. During that time, he advocated for better schools, for native community centres, for Indigenous people facing discrimination in a country that treated them as second-class citizens. He pushed for educational opportunities on the reserve and off it. He worked with local organisations to build support networks. He did the work of leadership without any of the recognition that leadership usually brings. He was 60 years old. He had been a logger, a longshoreman, a bus driver, a construction worker, a travelling musician and a chief. None of it had made him visible to the wider world. He had no reason to expect that would change. Then his son Bob changed everything, by accident. Bob George had gotten some small acting work on Canadian television. He'd been cast in a new CBC series called Caribou Country, filming in British Columbia's Chilcotin Valley. A white actor had been cast to play an Indigenous elder named Ol Antoine. When that actor fell ill, Bob suggested his father as a replacement. The producers needed someone fast. Dan George showed up on set with no training, no headshot, no agent, and no experience of any kind. He was 60 years old. He had never stood in front of a camera. He was a natural, not in the way people use that word to describe someone with raw talent that needs polishing. He was a natural the way water is wet. It wasn't something he was trying to be. He'd spent his entire life telling stories. The camera was just another listener. He played Ol Antoine from 1960 to 1967. The character was wise, warm, funny, and fully human. Nothing like the wooden cigar store stereotypes that had defined Indigenous characters in North American entertainment for a century. Audiences responded immediately. Critics noticed something unusual. This wasn't acting in the traditional sense. This was a man being himself inside a story. And then 1967 happened. Two things happened that year, and they both mattered in ways that nobody anticipated. The first was a play. Playwright George Riger was working on The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, a drama about a young Indigenous woman who leaves her reserve for the city and is destroyed by poverty, racism, and violence. Riger met Dan George and was so impressed by him that he rewrote the play, expanding the role of Rita Joe's father specifically for George. The play premiered at the Vancouver Playhouse in November 1967. It would later be selected to open the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. A critic who saw a later production in Washington, D.C., described the scene between George and the actress playing his daughter as one of the most devastating moments in Canadian theatre. He wasn't playing a character, he was playing a version of every Indigenous father who had watched his children be taken by a system designed to break them. Every line carried the weight of lived experience. The second thing that happened in 1967 was Canada Day. July 1st, 1967, the centennial of Canadian Confederation. The whole country was in a celebratory mood. Expo 67 was running in Montreal, showcasing cultures from around the world. In Vancouver, 32,000 people packed into Empire Stadium for a birthday party. There were fireworks planned and speeches and music. Chief Dan George had been invited to say a few words. His wife, Amy, had urged him to write something about what this day really meant to First Nations people. He composed his soliloquy at home. When it was finished, he stood in the family's living room and read it aloud for the first time. His children applauded, but the whole family was nervous. They had no idea whether a stadium full of celebrating Canadians would tolerate what he'd written. He walked to the podium, accompanied by drummers. That alone was remarkable for 1967. Indigenous drums at a national celebration. And then he spoke. He didn't celebrate, he mourned. He spoke directly to Canada as though the country were a person. He described what Confederation had taken from his people, the forests, the rivers, the freedom, the language, the children. He spoke of 100 years of promises that were never kept. He described a people who had once been self-sufficient and powerful, now pushed to the margins of the political and social fabric. But he didn't stop at grief. He also spoke of the future. He envisioned a day when Indigenous young people and chiefs would sit in the houses of law and government, ruling and being ruled by the knowledge and freedoms of the land. He called on his own people to grab the instruments of success and fight with them. It was a lament, but it was also a battle cry. The crowd sat in stunned silence. Then they rose to their feet and gave him a standing ovation. The next day, it was national news. The Vancouver Sun wrote that the man who took the boldest look at Canada's future was probably the person most tempted to look into the past. A journalist who'd been present described the moment in more vivid terms. He said George had sat on the birthday cake. that he'd stoned a crowd of 32,000 and nailed them to their seats. Even the smallest children, who couldn't possibly understand the words, were hushed by the sorrow in that voice. That speech, a lament for Confederation, didn't just make headlines. It changed the political landscape. Historians credit it with accelerating Indigenous political activism across British Columbia and across Canada. It created, for the first time, widespread sympathy for Indigenous rights among non-Indigenous Canadians. It forced a country to confront the fact that its founding story had a second narrator, one who had been silenced for a century. 6 years later, in part because of the momentum George helped create, the Supreme Court of Canada acknowledged in the Calder case that Aboriginal title still existed in Canadian law. It was a legal earthquake, and its tremors can be traced back to a man with a bass fiddle background standing in a football stadium, and the man who delivered that speech was 68 years old. His career as a public figure was barely 7 years old. Most people peak and then taper. Chief Dan George hadn't even started yet. In 1969, Disney brought him to Hollywood to reprise his old Antoine character in a film called Smith, opposite Glenn Ford. It was a small role. It was enough to get noticed. The following year, director Arthur Penn was casting a film called Little Big Man, a revisionist western starring Dustin Hoffman. The film needed an actor to play Old Lodge Skins, a Cheyenne chief who adopts Hoffman's character as his grandson. The role had reportedly been offered to Marlon Brando, who turned it down. Other sources say Laurence Olivier was Penn's first choice. When Richard Boone, who'd been cast next, backed out at the last minute, someone suggested the old Canadian from the CBC show. Consider the absurdity. Hollywood had been making westerns for half a century by 1970, hundreds of films, and in virtually every one of them, Indigenous characters were played either by white actors in brownface or reduced to one of two templates: the noble savage who dies conveniently, or the violent threat who deserves to be shot. There were exceptions, but they were rare. Indigenous actors existed. Jay Silverheels had played Tonto, but even Tonto was a sidekick defined by his relationship to a white hero. No Indigenous actor had ever been the reason an audience came to the theatre. Dan George was 70 years old. He walked onto the set of a major Hollywood production and delivered one of the most memorable performances of 1970. Old Lodge Skins was wise, funny, spiritually grounded, and profoundly dignified. He wasn't a prop or a cliché. He was a fully realized human being with depth, humor, and pain. Dustin Hoffman later said he was amazed by George's energy during grueling 13-hour shooting days, 6 days a week. The man in his 70s was always prepared with his lines, always present, always giving more than the script asked for. George reportedly rewrote some of his own dialogue. He replaced the screenwriter's version of Indigenous speech, the version that sounded like a white person's idea of how a chief might talk, with language drawn from actual Indigenous perspectives and oral tradition. The result was a character unlike anything Hollywood had produced. When Old Lodge Skins spoke, the rhythms were real, the humor was real, the grief was real, the dignity wasn't performed, it was carried in from a life. The film earned over $31 million at the domestic box office on a $7 million budget. It was a hit. And Chief Dan George received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, the first Indigenous person in history to be nominated for an Oscar. He was 71 years old. He had 36 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, and the moment should have been the greatest triumph of his life. It wasn't. Not entirely. Less than 3 weeks before the Academy Awards ceremony in April 1971, Amy George died. She'd been his wife for 51 years. She knew she was dying as the nomination came in. According to their children, she told him that if she died, he should not hesitate to go to the ceremony. She'd been there for the residential school years, the logging years, the longshoreman years, the truck and bass fiddle years, the years of raising children on a reserve where the government controlled whether you could leave. She'd been there for all of it. She wasn't there for this. When reporters called to ask how he felt about the nomination, George didn't talk about the honor or the ceremony or Hollywood. He said, "I don't want the Indians called second-class people anymore." He said the nomination achieved a goal he'd set when he took up acting at 62, to do something that would give a name to the Indian people. He said he was proud to see Indigenous people who watched Little Big Man walk out of the theatre and walk up to a white man and shake him by the hand. The film hadn't just entertained them, it had given them a version of themselves they'd never seen on screen, one with dignity. He didn't win the Oscar that night. The award went to John Mills for Ryan's Daughter, but George won the National Society of Film Critics Award and the New York Film Critics Circle Award. And in the same year, Canada named him an Officer of the Order of Canada. On March 11th, 1971, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs proclaimed Chief Dan George Day in Vancouver. The proclamation said he had been instrumental in showing that the Indian, too often portrayed as either a bloodthirsty savage or a dirty drunk, was a man with all the strengths, weaknesses, emotions and feelings of other men, a man who had become almost a stranger in the land he once owned. The years after the nomination were the busiest of his life, and George used every second of visibility the way a man uses water in a drought, carefully, completely, without waste. Hollywood called again and again, and he took the roles. But he was selective. He refused any part he thought might be demeaning to Indigenous people. Every role had to pass a test, his son Leonard described years later. The first question his father always asked himself was whether this was good for his people. If the answer was no, the money didn't matter. He appeared on talk shows and used every minute of airtime to advocate. When Dick Cavett asked him on national television whether it was easier to be Indigenous in Canada than in the United States, George answered with a single word, no. No explanation, no qualification, just no. He played Sam Two Feathers in Harry and Tonto in 1974, opposite Art Carney. In 1972, he served as national chairman of International Brotherhood Week and was involved in the annual tuberculosis Christmas seal drive. He was named Grand Marshal of the Calgary Stampede Parade. He was presented with a lifetime membership in the Chiefs Executive Council. He recorded an album with the band Fireweed, a country rock collaboration that the Georgia Strait later called one of the 50 most important Vancouver albums, a record where country rock and cultural reconciliation collided. And then in 1976, Clint Eastwood cast him as Lone Waututh in the outlaw Josie Wales. George was 77. He sometimes forgot his lines on set. Eastwood reportedly said 3 words that changed the production: "Tell your story." George did. When Lone Waututh spoke about the Trail of Tears, about loss and survival and finding humour in tragedy, he wasn't channeling research. He was drawing from generational memory, from stories that had been told for 100 years because they had to be told or they would disappear. Critics said he nearly stole the entire film from Eastwood. One reviewer described his performance as an eerily perfect balance of dignity and humour. Another simply called it the most authentic Indigenous portrayal in any Western ever made. He published My Heart Soars in 1974, a collection of poetry and philosophy that became one of the most widely read works by an Indigenous Canadian author. The poems were simple and devastating. They spoke of the beauty of trees, the softness of air, the fragrance of grass, the taste of salmon, the trail of the sun. They spoke of the life that never goes away. They were the words of a man who had watched his culture be banned, his language be forbidden, his name be erased, and who still found a way to say that his heart soars. A second volume, My Spirit Soars, would be published after his death. But underneath the productivity and the fame, something was hollowing out. His son Leonard later said that his father never fully recovered from Amy's death. The grief wasn't dramatic, it was quiet and permanent. It was the kind of grief that sits in a room like low-frequency sound. You can't always hear it, but you feel it in your bones. Leonard attributed his father's own death a decade later, partly to that unresolved loss. George continued to work. He appeared in films like Shadow of the Hawk and Cold Journey. He played a role in the television miniseries Centennial. His last film was Spirit of the Wind in 1979, where he played a scruffy, venerable trainer of sled dogs. He was 80 years old. He was still showing up, still prepared, still carrying a presence into every room that had nothing to do with acting technique and everything to do with a life fully lived. In the summer of 1981, George gathered his family together. He told them not to hold on to him. He said he'd had a full life. He told them to keep their traditions, but to live for the future, not the past. On September 23, 1981, Chief Dan George died in his sleep at Lionsgate Hospital in North Vancouver. He was 82 years old. He was buried at Burrard Cemetery on the same reserve where he'd been born, the same piece of land the government had drawn a line around and called a reserve, a fraction of the territory his ancestors had occupied for millennia. He left behind 6 children and 36 grandchildren. His son Leonard succeeded him as chief. His granddaughter Lee Maracle became a celebrated Indigenous author. His granddaughter Charlene Alec became a prominent activist. His granddaughter Joan Phillip was elected to the British Columbia legislature, fulfilling, in a small but concrete way, the prophecy he'd made in 1967 about Indigenous people sitting in the houses of law. In 2008, Canada Post put his face on a postage stamp in its Canadians in Hollywood series, alongside Marie Dressler, Norma Shearer, and Raymond Burr. A longshoreman from a reserve in North Vancouver, recognised in the same breath as some of the biggest names in the history of film. At the opening ceremony of the 2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics, actor Donald Sutherland read from My Heart Soars to a global audience of billions. The words of a man who'd been forbidden to speak his own language were broadcast to every corner of the planet. Schools in Toronto and Abbotsford bear his name. A theatre at the University of Victoria carries it. Film critics trace a direct line from his Oscar nomination to the shift in how Hollywood portrayed Indigenous people, a line that runs through Dances with Wolves, through Graham Greene's Oscar nomination for that film, through every Indigenous actor and filmmaker who's been given a role with dimension instead of a caricature. Indigenous author Jeanette Armstrong called him one of the earliest influences on her own writing and said his work helped draw out many more Indigenous voices across Canada. Today, Indigenous actors, directors and storytellers are building on the foundation he laid. In the 1970s, Dan George stood virtually alone in Hollywood. He proved that an Indigenous man could be both a powerful actor and a principled advocate. He did both with grace. So what really happened with Chief Dan George? A boy was born with the name Geswanouth Slahoot, and a government took it away. He was sent to a school designed to erase who he was. He spent decades in labour that left him injured and anonymous. He loaded ships and drove buses and played bass fiddle in the back of a truck while his children danced in costumes that weren't their own, because their own culture had been made illegal by the country they lived in. And then, at an age when most people are settling into the quiet end of things, he stepped in front of a camera for the first time. He stepped onto a stage and spoke the truth to a country that had spent 100 years refusing to listen. He walked into Hollywood and showed them what an Indigenous man looked like when he was written as a human being instead of a prop. He did it all while carrying the weight of a system that had tried to break him since he was 5 years old. He didn't do it with anger. He didn't do it with spectacle. He did it with patience and dignity and a kind of quiet stubbornness that had kept his people alive for generations before anyone drew a line on a map and told them where they were allowed to live. The residential schools tried to take his identity. They took his name, his language, 11 years of his childhood. They didn't take his voice. It just took 60 years for anyone to listen. He died on the same piece of earth where he was born. Between those 2 points, he'd changed what an entire continent understood about the people who were there first. And when his family asked what he wanted them to remember, he didn't talk about the Oscar nomination. He didn't mention the speech. He didn't bring up Hollywood. He said, keep your traditions and live for the future. That was Geswanouth Slahoot. That was Chief Dan George, a man who spent 6 decades being invisible and then made sure no one could ever look away again.